Do you feel lonely? Do you feel like no matter what you do, it doesn't matter and you'll never find love and your daily existence is a meaningless, monotonous dribble of boredom, alleviated by hedonism and that no one treats you like a real human being, with you just being a cog in the machine? Have you tried dating apps only for the results to be incredibly depressing and have resigned yourself to loneliness? Well, psych, you're alone. You're a loser. I'm just fucking with you. I'm guessing for the vast majority of this audience, that was a hard yes. The reason I'm saying that is that I've heard this from the vast majority of young people I meet. I'm a pretty social guy and I talk to all kinds of people, and almost every young man, even ones that are billionaires, male models, incredibly charismatic, or sociable, have told me this. There was a Greek philosopher named Diogenes who wandered around the city of Athens with a lamp looking for an honest man, and the bit was that he never found one. In my process of founding a social club in Los Angeles, I struggled to find a single young person who's not lonely and likes their dating and social life, and I have continued to fail. The question I'd like to answer in this video is why is it the case and what to do about it. I'm going to use my understanding of history and society to explain the variables and conditions causing this, which are more complicated and go deeper than you could possibly imagine, showing the seedy underbelly of our culture. This video is a lot of research to make, and a great resource to look at if you're trying to figure out history in the world is Magellan TV, which has a great series Queens about female monarchs in the 16th century. It's entertaining, educational, and interesting, and it's only one of many shows found on Magellan TV, a documentary streaming service made by filmmakers with the best selection of historical documentaries and movies out there. They have content covering a wide variety of topics, including biographies, true crime, and nature. Magellan is compatible with just about any device and is 4K HD with no additional cost. It's a great platform for an affordable price. What If Altus viewers can get a 1-month free trial using the link in the video description. Magellan TV is for you, and start learning about whatever interests you today. This video is structured a bit differently than many of my others. I'm pulling on less academic and historical material and more from anecdotal evidence I've gathered from just talking to people. And a lot of ways this is because this is a less academic topic. What academia writes about is always 10 to 20 years behind what the actual problems are in society. Growing up in Pennsylvania, I was so surprised that no one talked about deindustrialization and the collapse of our middle-class jobs, which was obvious in my area until Trump made them too public to ignore. Also, most academics are older people who are very disconnected from problems that overwhelmingly target the young like this. Dating is also a really human thing that can't be quantified as well and has to be treated more as an art than a science. I have a really large network and talk to all varieties of people, so I've heard most perspectives in society. I understand this video is less scientific than others, but I'm a YouTuber, so I really don't have to be scientific all the time. And I think people need to put out these theories explaining stuff like this, since this is such an important issue to all of us. One of the points I'm going to tease out in this video is that I don't think anyone is really to blame here. I generally believe that when you're talking to someone, they really just want to be heard and understood. I think we're all children of God, and so when I talk to people, I try to connect with and not judge them. Because of that, I hear lots of people's personal stories about their loneliness and dating lives. What I've found is that most people just want to blame some other group, whether men, women, feminism, porn, and the like, or they'll say someone else is really doing well, like women, chads, the rich, tall, etc. However, what I've seen talking to chads, beautiful women, the rich, incels, and every other group is that most people are trying their best in a hard system, and no one is really winning or at the top. Ridiculous as it sounds, even the so-called chads who have had lots of sex really don't like it and feel depressed in the current system. This kind of reminds me of my videos on social collapses, or why the rise of food's skyrocketing right now, all of which aren't really caused by a single person or thing, but rather complicated confluences of variables that hurt everyone. I think there are 3 big reasons that make dating very difficult, and by moving through those, I'll explain how they will affect our society's development in the future. These problems all bleed together, forming a coherent net of depression that's massively holding society back. Our problems with dating and marriage relate back to broader problems in our whole modern civilization that merely manifest here. I sincerely believe that if we can't solve these problems over the next 50 or so years, our civilization is doomed to fall back into another dark age. That sounds bombastic, but I'll explain why over the course of this video. The question I'm sure a lot of people, especially older folks, will be asking at this point is it really that bad? Isn't this just something incels or other people at the bottom of the social totem pole complain about? The answer I'll give is an unequivocal yes. Let's look at some stats. The amount of young men under the age of 30 that have had no sex since turning age 18, or are basically virgins, has nearly quadrupled over the last 15 years, going from 8 to 27% of the population. The horrible thing to consider is that since this is something young men are insecure about, they're probably massively lying or skewing the data in a survey like this, so the real numbers are undoubtedly much higher. I mean, also, in many ways, this is just scraping the bottom of the barrel, where there's a world of difference between having had one sexual partner since turning age 18 and having a rich sexual life that could make a young man happy. And you have to imagine that if, let's say, a third of the population under the age of 30 are virgins, conservatively, that a much higher amount of men are not satisfied with their sexual lives. This is the first time ever in American and possibly world history where a majority of the population is childless and unmarried at age 30. This is also the first time when a majority of people in their 20s are single. 60% of single women and 43% of single men have just given up on dating, are trying to date, or looking for someone at all. 90% of young people feel lonely on a regular basis. The largest group in America has literally 0 friends today. On the marriage side, which comes out of dating, half of all marriages end in divorce. I'll tell you a bit about my own personal story. At the start of 2021, I joined an organization for exceptional young people run by someone who used to be part of Jake Paul's management. It had NBA stars, Netflix actresses, billionaires, and the like. It wasn't really the Illuminati. We weren't plotting to take over the world. We just got drunk together a lot. It got shut down due to a crisis in its leadership, but I've teamed up with the former guy who was a de facto co-founder to recreate it in LA. From this, I've met some of the most successful young people in the country. Also, What If Altist is a really sick and wonderful fan base of successful, interesting, and really cool people who tend to watch this content. From these two bases, I have a data set of hundreds of incredibly interesting, successful young people. Also, I've been a digital nomad, living in a bunch of countries, and I purposely reach out to different kinds of people in different parts of society and the world to get their perspective so I can feel like I have a good idea of what life is like for different people. The reason I bring this up is that under normal circumstances, you would see the more successful young people in society having the most romantic and sexual opportunities. However, if that demographic is screwed, what's happening to everyone else? Just like Diogenes in Athens, the more you see, the more depressed you get. The thing I've found is that the most successful guys in society often struggle as much in dating as normal people. Often even more, in fact, since they tend to end up in entirely male-dominated industries. Of the 50 most attractive, charismatic, successful, high-value guys I know, about 3 are in relationships, and most of those aren't even good relationships. Very high-quality women like actresses, singers, models, and the like tend to be in relationships, but the norm is for them to often date far beneath their own level. If you're a beautiful model, you're probably dating a nearly broke photographer you met at work or some guy you ran into who lives at your apartment. Normal people like to assume the rich live amazing lives, which often really isn't true. Our standard of living for young people isn't that great since cost of living in major cities is insane, and there aren't people throwing crazy parties and networking all the time. The most successful people in my age group tend to live lives much like normal people, just with a bit more money. However, what caused these issues? In the same way that when you pull up a log in the woods, you see the maggots eating it from inside that are normally hidden, I will show what I believe the causes of these things and what it means for society. Number 1, the internet. If you are a man or a pretty large chunk of women, the only real way to date today is through dating apps. Unless you're in school or you have some special factor like you're in a town where the church is extremely strong, there simply is no other way to meet the other sex on a frequent basis. This isn't something I've wanted to believe, but as I've seen more and more of the world, it's become an unavoidable conclusion. Young people really don't go to bars anymore, and no one really has strong enough social networks to do dating through people they've actually met. It's kind of insane since dating apps were viewed as weird and suspect 10 to 15 years ago, but now they're mandatory. This is horrifying since the apps are terrible and possibly the worst way you could ever design dating in a society. Let's start with how, if dating apps were a country, they would be the second most unequal in the world. Tinder as a country is right behind South Africa in inequality, the most unequal country in the world, and ahead of Venezuela. The impression I've gotten from Tinder is that you can still be a really handsome guy and wealthy and get very little luck. And it's not even the top 10 or 5% of men who do well, it's the top 1 or less. It's very similar to the American economy, where the top 1% aren't the people who are getting the most. It's the top 0.1 who get far outsized gains. I have a friend who is a handsome guy, incredibly charismatic, and kind of genius, and he's put his intelligence behind trying to hack the dating apps. He's also a very professionally successful multimillionaire tech CEO. He's done stuff like run 5 accounts on each of the major dating apps, have an assistant manage each of those accounts, automate his text replies, and get professional grade photos while working out every day. He's found that he can get a good amount of average quality girls, but that none are of quality that he would marry or even date long term. This is evidence I've corroborated from my own personal experience and other friends who have done similar things. This is since women tend to have 2 separate settings for dating, and we've found this in studies. Women have higher standards since they can only have 1 child a year, while a man could theoretically sire 1,000 in a year. The process of raising a human child is also incredibly long, expensive, and laborious. Women either want a man who will support and commit to them for that long haul, and if they can't find that, they'll have a one-night stand with the highest genetic quality of man, just for the value of his seed, even with the expectation he won't stick around. A woman might have a one-night stand with Jason Derulo knowing that he will never raise a child with them, since he's Jason Derulo. The sexual dynamic created by the apps is that there are very few winners. Lots of men think that women love the apps since they can get as much sex as they want since they're preyed at infinite amounts of guys. But they don't realize that's not what women generally want. I've heard it feels like going through a bazaar, getting hawked at by all the people trying to sell their products. No woman without serious psychological problems really wants to have sex with a different guy every night of the week as a stable thing, since sex is emotionally very different for women than men since they pair bonds during it. Remember, biologically sex is much more expensive for women than men, and so their bodies release oxytocin during sex to emotionally connect them to the man, which doesn't happen for men. For women, promiscuous sex often feels terrible, and even though they might occasionally fuck a Chad off Tinder when they need the release, they're not really looking to lock down Mr. Right, with an exception I'll discuss later. However, they're not meeting Mr. Right on dating apps, rather guys that pretend to be him and then leave them. Most of the highest quality women I know don't trust dating apps at all and use them out of necessity. For the vast majority of men, they get nothing or crumbs from dating apps. Remember, since we've basically erased every other form of dating, this means that the vast majority of men, excepting basically those who are in the top 1% or more of attractiveness, have very few dates. Also, although I don't know from personal experience, I've heard from gay friends that contrary to expectation, this is similar in the gay community, where gay guys are generally more willing to have sex than women are. However, this just means that conditions become more competitive and gay men become more picky, and so you see the same kind of stratification coming out of the dating apps. Remember, this applies for very wealthy and charismatic guys, people who would already be married in every other era. This group of men are basically hopeless with no direction forward. For the Chads who do well in this system, things really aren't that great either. Lots of my friends are people you could call Chads who have lots of sex and are fuckboys. However, none of them are happy about it for the reason I've explained before, since they can never find a girl they really want to settle down with. 3 separate times I've had a different fuckboy friend on my couch crying about how miserable being a fuckboy is. After a certain point, you just hate what you're doing in the endless, meaningless game of trying to trick girls to sleep with you by faking commitment. The guys who don't get a lot of action might be saying, come on, how can that be a real thing? But I've seen this too much up close to be able to discount it. A big reason this process is so depressing is that it's incredibly dehumanizing. Online dating hookup culture, in reality, is a machine for sex and broken hearts more than anything else. It's literally a machine that assesses you for your beauty and nothing else, lets you have sex with someone else, and then spits you out when you want emotional support.
Our modern society conceptualizes everything through the factory and industry, and so with free love we thought, okay, let's just increase the volume of sex, and then we'll have a lot more sex. But the problem is that you fundamentally can't separate sex from the relationships of the different people involved. And is it any irony that once we push free love in society that the amount of sex collapsed? And for sex, relationships, and all that stuff to work, you can't just increase the volume, which is what dating apps try to do, but you need to bring together people who share a lot of similarities so that they have a chance of a relationship working.
Talking to everyone, one of the lessons I've learned is that we all just really want love, and the system doesn't provide that at all. When I talk about the most successful members in society struggling to date, including very beautiful and wonderful women alongside wealthy men, the biggest reason is just that the acquisition system is broken. If the network people have is Tinder, that becomes the only thing that matters, and the flaws inherent in Tinder ripple across the whole society, while all the other things that would benefit you in the real world in dating suddenly don't carry nearly as much value. No one really likes the dating apps, and people use them out of necessity. But the reason they're so prevalent stems back to other factors in our society related to technology, that being the digital revolution. For young people, our lives are by all accounts spent almost entirely behind screens. Any type of community, even to a growing point school and work, is done through a screen. It often feels like communities have never really rebuilt since the pandemic due to it forcing us to spend our entire lives in the digital world. I'd like to say the most apt metaphor for the problems inherent in modern dating is a recession or even a sexual Great Depression. This is since it's a situation, like real recessions, that's caused by macroeconomic, social, and historic factors that hurts everyone involved by lowering the supply and functioning of the broader system. In the same way that an economy can be in a recession while still having all the key components for wealth, like the workers, resources, and the like, we can have everything we need to not have these problems, but the system is still fundamentally not healthy. A key factor here is that this is most damage to marriage, since marriages are most successful when people share values, and that normally comes from marrying someone in the same social class, ethnicity, region, religion, occupation, and the like, which is self-selected through social communities. Thus, when you remove social communities, you throw people together who share very little, thus dropping the chances of a successful relationship. We really have to keep in mind how recent these technologies are, in that the iPhone, which dominates our lives so much today, was made a little bit over 10 years ago. That means that people in our age group are really guinea pigs in a giant social experiment. We are all addicts from social media, sacrificing everything in our lives to it. In the same way addicts will sacrifice their families, work, and lives for addictions, so our social structure is being broken by digitization. It kind of reminds me what the introduction of opium was like from the British in 19th century China. Life in China was incredibly hard since the country was incredibly overpopulated, and people would work very long hours in grueling poverty. Opium in many ways became a necessary thing to just deal with how hard life was, and the Chinese called it an extra hour of light in the day. Meanwhile, there were no social mores to deal with it, and so large amounts of China's population became addicts. I don't think it's misguided to refer to technology as an addictive substance, given it's literally designed to be that way. Many of my good friends are tech CEOs, and they've plumbed my knowledge to try to find ways to keep their audiences on their products for as long as possible. Instagram, Facebook, Tinder, and the like literally have teams of social psychologists who test and design them so they can hack your attention and your genetic weaknesses. This is something that's very heavily backed up by the evidence, and there's an incredibly hilarious graph of the invention of the iPhone and the teen pregnancy rate, which then collapsed, or the invention of Tinder followed by the mass rise of sexlessness in young men. The top writer on addiction, Johann Hari, has a theory that I believe is correct, that it's a way of filling missing holes in the rest of our lives, like not having purpose, love, meaningful work, and the like. What they've found is that internet addicts, or the people who are more addicted than the rest of us, are normally doing it as a way to escape the rest of their lives. As Robert Putnam proves in his famous book Bowling Alone, social connections have been collapsing for decades with the rise of the internet. And as Peter Turchin has proved in his book Ages of Discord, quality of life has collapsed for the average American over the last 50 years. This means that in the same way China was falling apart when opium arrived, the internet became a way to fill the holes in our social and economic lives, to escape to a digital world where you didn't have to think about it. I'm going to cover this in much more detail later, but young people show many of the traits of addicts. Addicts don't feel comfortable away from their substances in the same way young people don't feel comfortable socializing and are always in front of their screens. It consumes large parts of their lives, pushing everything else of value like family, relationships, fun, values, or just doing stuff outside. As I've talked about in my video on Gen Z, the hallmark look of our generation is a completely emotionally hollow, zombie-like person who is always attached to their screen, and then freaks out and becomes incredibly angry when things go wrong, which sounds like an addict. I see this process manifest powerfully in colleges, where I never really went to college, so I haven't experienced this firsthand, but from what I've heard, college dating and sexual life is pretty broken. People are often antisocial, don't do much except stay in their rooms, and college is often pretty isolating for a lot of people. This was really worsened with the pandemic, but if college kids who live in proximity and hang out aren't having fun, you know society is really broken. Before I move on to the next topic, I just want to throw in this is not a blanket disapproval of the internet and technology. For me to do that would be insanely hypocritical, given the internet is my livelihood and also how I've met almost all of my friends. It also makes our lives so much more interesting and convenient. The internet allows the most absolutely remarkable things, but also causes these problems we're talking about here. A big side effect of the internet is the coarsification and depersonalization of sex. In the environment humans evolved in which social circles were small and everyone knew everyone else, sex was something that A, happened with people you knew really well and thus was difficult to split off from the personality of that person, and B, was very intimately connected with baby making, something that only shifted due to the invention of the birth control pill 60 years ago. However, with the rise of the internet and the pill, sex became removed from these conditions of personality and child rearing to just become the emotion, lust, and fucking. A very large factor with this is porn, which went from being something that was very difficult to get to being completely ubiquitous. It wouldn't surprise me if over 95% of young men watch porn regularly. It's perfectly designed to hack into the male brain and is free. I have mixed feelings about porn. On one side, it totally does objectify women, make men view women less as human beings and more as sexual objects, and all that stuff. For lots of young men, especially in the under-socialized side, porn is basically the only frame of reference they have for women. And so they don't have the tools to realize that it's entertainment and that if you try the same stuff on a real girl, it's not going to go so great. Also, I know loads of guys who are addicted to porn, where it's something they actively resent given they need it and they watch progressively more and more disgusting stuff at higher frequencies, since the only way to quelch the massive dopamine hits is to push further. However, I would say no man gets that stuck into porn when they actually have strong sexual opportunities. In the same way, addiction is normally a side effect of the rest of your life being dysfunctional. I largely don't believe it when people say porn has lessened people having sex, given most guys, if given the opportunity, would replace porn for sex in an instant. Which brings me to the other side of porn, and that I'm actually pretty grateful for it, since I think we might have had a revolution without it. Across history, large groups of sexually frustrated young men are a great predictor for wars and national crises, since they feel the need to do something as their entire ancestral line's about to die. It wouldn't surprise me at all if porn forestalled the crisis of the 21st century by a decade, since men were able to crank it to videos of the most beautiful women in the world, rather than start revolutions. Porn, rather than religion, as Marx said, is the real opiate of the masses. Part 2. Social Collapse. The Industrial Revolution has changed our lives in such a tremendous way, and in many ways, the history of the world since has been about trying to create social relations that allow us to go forward with it. However, since the task is so daunting and the process of change is so painful, we've often ended up with horrifying totalitarian ideologies that cover up the pain of uncertainty by offering total certainty, even if that's a massive lie that will kill their whole society. Due to a combination of technological and social change, society has changed at such a rapid speed that we, in America at least, are in a valueless society, in which no one really knows what to do or what rules to maintain. The power of religion has gone in a tremendous amount, and in the process, we realize how much religion really did to create common cultural consensuses and the philosophic foundations of our society. As my right-hand man once said, a society without religion is like a nation without a capital. The thing is that raising a family and mating is really expensive for humans, in that you have to support and guide a child for 18 years at least. And so these cultural norms are necessary since they create shared rules of conduct that allow cooperation between different people to work seamlessly. In the year 1800, everyone knew what was expected from a groom, bride, the child, and the like, since the society was universally Christian. A society without shared values will experience gradual degradation and collapse, as we are now witnessing. At the same time, humans need socializing and to be taught how to be good partners, which has totally collapsed. Our modern ideology views humans as both blank slates and noble savages, or that humans are naturally good and kind, and society makes them bad, something that literally all the evidence does not support, and that humans can be programmed by their societies to believe whatever, which the evidence is directly opposed to.
The evidence very clearly points to there being psychological differences between the two sexes, and you can say that men and women are different without saying one is better than the other, and because they both very clearly need each other, you can't say that one sex is blanketly terrible, because without it, we'd all die. And I think a good way of looking at the differences between men and women are that men have much higher rates of autism and sociopathy. And that's because the male brain was made for hunting and waging war as a group, and thus is much higher in systematizing. Meanwhile, the female brain was made to raise children and hold the community together, and so women are much higher in empathizing, and thus women have much higher rates of depression and schizophrenia, which are what happens when you get stuck in your head too much. Coming from this, you can see men's weaknesses being sociopathic or caddish, or sleeping with lots of girls and then breaking their hearts and leaving after manipulating them, or being lazy slobs and not being well put together because they don't have women's natural anchor of having to raise a child for 20 years. And at the same time, due to having to wage war and fight in groups together, men are better at coordinating structures, which is why, across the history of mankind, every large structure, whether corporations, religions, governments, militaries, were built by men. And since men built the structures, they could oppress women, which is why, for so much of human history, women have been brutally repressed. Meanwhile, for women's negatives, since men have protected them against the harshest parts of the outside world, whether clearing forests, waging war, fighting off tigers, women can afford to be more delusional, unrealistic, and emotional than men because they were protected from the harshest things. And you see this in how genetically we have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors because so many of the male ancestors died. On top of that, society has much more expectations for men because the weight of women having children is so massive. Where, for example, you can ask a young man to die for his country, never ask that of a young woman. If a young man isn't financially successful, he's a loser. Or, in an argument, if a woman bursts into tears, she can still be respected, while a man would just be viewed as a complete loser for bursting into tears. And because women have the weight of raising children, society has higher expectations for men. You can see this in dating preferences, where in a study on this, men largely want three things from a future partner. They want her to be cute, and she doesn't have to be gorgeous, interesting, and kind. Well, meanwhile, they did the same study for women. Women chose about 300 separate things for a man.
Healthy societies try to push against these negative traits, often by structuring marriages where guys can only get sex if they commit to a single woman, and women also in turn have to curb their worst aspects in order to support their families. However, our society has what I would say is the worst socialization around sex by far of any era in history ever. This is since our current ruling class structures its power around not having any sexual structures.
In many ways, modern society is built off the idea of the factory. And our current elite are people from college degrees who are managers of large corporations or in the government, who in fact want to make society more like a factory and turn people into more like interchangeable cogs that can be removed from each other and have no identity. And this is why critical theory, or the post-Marxist Frankfurt School philosophers, are so popular, since by deconstructing gender, ethnicity, every other piece of identity people would have, it gives the managerial elite more power over society. I mean, the reason corporations are siding with what are generally worthwhile causes like minority rights or sexual liberation is because it can allow them to reorder society in a way that they'd want to and give them all the power. And this group controls our largest corporations, it controls the media, Hollywood, the government bureaucracy, the elected government today, the higher and lower education, and larger parts of the military and defense contractors, or every major institution in society. This sounds like a right-wing conspiracy theory on my part, but if you look at what these philosophers literally said, like the Frankfurt School, Yuri Bezmenov, or Saul Alinsky, that they would literally deconstruct Western civilization and functioning organizations in society and functioning structures so that they would fall apart, so that people would have to move on to Marxism and its descendant philosophies. This is what the people involved, who the modern activists who follow these philosophies quote, literally say they were doing. What critical theory literally teaches is that all the negative aspects of a culture come from the oppressor, and if you remove the oppressor, then we'll all be living in a utopia. However, if you start with the pretty reasonable assumption that no one is perfect and that we all make mistakes, from this more balanced understanding of human nature, you would come to the conclusion that the oppressed and the oppressors, as normal people, would both have done good and bad things. However, modern third-wave feminism believes that every single problem with women's existence is due to male oppression, and if you criticize a woman for anything, then you're sexist.
An example of this idea is slut-shaming. In real evolutionary terms, slut-shaming is largely an activity by women. Guys want girls to be sluts and to be naked and wear as little as possible. A bill allowing toplessness in public would get massive support from young men.
A female friend of mine once asked me, why is sleeping with lots of different guys liberating me from the patriarchy because I'm just doing what guys want me to do? And the answer is you only view it as liberating if you view the entire previous culture as oppressive, and thus by breaking the previous culture's sexual norms, you're doing something good in of itself.
However, feminism blames men for slut-shaming, while in reality it's a natural outgrowth of women's biological strategies. Since the value of female sex is higher, women ought to work as a union to keep the value of sex high, to get as much out of men as possible. This is better for society because it also forces men to do as much as possible. Thus, sluts are like workers who agree to work for half the wages the union wants, thus defeating the striking workers and forcing all women to put out more sexually in order to have a relationship and get male attention. Some of the other examples are kind of hilarious. For example, I've seen feminist articles blame that office buildings are too cold because they're pandering for men, or that it's men's fault that men are less interested in astrology than women. When you see stuff like this, you're looking at what amounts to unfair resentment and hatred of men, rather than any actual attempt to broaden the collective society. And that's something that young men can understand and realize that they're stuck in.
There are e-girls on social media that'll post stuff like just masturbated and then get tens of thousands of likes. And the thing I'll think to myself is, if literally anyone except an attractive girl posted that, it would be the end of their career and social life.
I consider myself a decently handsome guy, and if I did that, it would probably totally end my career, as well as alienating myself from a good amount of my friends as a pervert or creep. However, since a girl does it, it's sex positive, which means good for some reason. Critical theory gets its power from dismantling the previous structures of society. It views this as a moral good in of itself and doesn't put any thought in, wait, maybe since this social structure exists in every society since the dawn of time, it might be necessary. Thus, to encourage women to have sex all the time is good simply since it breaks against convention, because convention must be oppressive. However, people need said social structures in order to make the inherently expensive and nerve-wracking process of mating and having children to work, since people need to be able to predict and trust each other's actions. I mean, also, where did the idea that men and women should be equal in every single regard even come from? Men and women are pretty different biologically, with, their different sexual purposes being the most evident form of it, but they also have different neurological structures, different personality averages, and since there's diversity in all things in the world, between ethnic groups, between lingual groups, why would you expect men and women to get the exact same outcomes, and why would that only be a function of oppression? In some ways, this makes sense given the pill was invented only 60 years ago. The pill released us from hundreds of millions of years of sex being inextricably linked to babies. From that perspective, it makes sense that the pressure cooker that came out of it would say sex in all circumstances was good, especially for women, who bear by far the heaviest weight from sex. There's a fascinating book called The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, which goes through how humans evolved to have the dating and sexual customs we do, and how so many of our behaviors are driven by evolutionary psychology. One of the most fascinating points it makes is that you need to view the different sexes and even different social groups within the sexes as competing to push their own self-interest in Darwinism. The social customs and genetic wiring we have is the result of compromises that subconsciously get made between men and women over evolutionary history on what both sides are willing to agree to in order to have kids when maintained. The social customs and genetic wiring we have is the subconscious result of millions of years of Darwinistic self-selection on what both of the sexes are willing to agree to in order to have kids. However, one of the very interesting points he makes is that men have different genetic strategies, as we talked about women having so earlier, where they divide women into the biological categories of I'll sleep with her and she can raise the kid, or I'll marry her. This is called the Madonna whore complex and has been shown in scientific studies, which seems kind of ludicrous to me since any straight male can explain this. The argument he makes is that Victorian society tried to repress male sexuality as much as possible and make women seem as pure as possible in order to push the Madonna button as hard as possible so guys would get married and form stable society.
However, society asks both men and women to be sexually liberated, and then is shocked when it receives the consequences that you would expect from those actions. I've talked a lot here about how feminism has been misapplied in our age group, but I think it's really important to have empathy with young women and see where young women are coming from, because as a demographic, young women are the most depressed population and have had rates of depression and self-harm and all that stuff go up by massive amounts over the last 20 years, and they're the most depressed in the historic record. A lot of this stemming from social media, where they have nonstop competition and judgment as well as unfair beauty standards. Also, the breakdown of social communities have had harder effects on women's psychology than men's.
I mean, a point I'd like to make is that it's actively against the self-interest of third wave feminism to make women happy. If women have good relationships with men, live fulfilling lives and the like, they're not going to push for the movement's goals. Feminism, in hating men, the family, community, society, and the like, leaves women feeling isolated. As Eric Hoffer said in his book on totalitarian movements, they isolate the individual from everything else except the movement, leaving them in a void where only the movement can fill the holes in their psyches. There's a spectrum in cognition between men and women, or empathizing and systematizing. If you push the male brain too far, you get autism, and if you push the female brain too far, you get social justice, which empathizes without the ability to think or act coherently. This is why the common stereotype is that women are unrealistic and act out of emotion, since they had to evolve to be more emotional and empathetic as a way to help raise the next generation into stable, happy adults, while men had to evolve to be more systematizing in order to hunt as a group. However, modern society is no moral structure for young women, having absolutely no standards to measure them against. If you ever criticize a woman, you will be called sexist. A crazy extension of this logic is with the #MeToo movement, where any woman can cancel any man's career with absolutely no real evidence, which is completely insane, and of course it would be abused.
I mean, I know several guys that have been unfairly Me Too'd, and it's often a way for a girl to have leverage over a guy where the guy does something she didn't like sleeping with one of her friends, or leaving her after a hookup, or she just feels gross after the hookup, and it's a way of getting back at the guy, and our society provides absolutely no consequences or responsibility around it.
It's normal for power without check to drive people crazy and to get abused. There are countless historical examples of this, with emperors being dime a dozen.
And I hear a lot of women say, why don't guys pick us up in bookstores or coffee shops anymore? And the answer is, every dude I know who has beyond a certain degree of dating experience has had an experience where they've done something innocuous and a woman has reacted in a totally overblown way. And it makes it kind of scary to take chances anymore.
This whole situation has added a really nasty degree of paranoia and cynicism to dating. I've been talking a lot about the flaws in women so far, but for men, things aren't sunshine and roses either. Women complain that men are disgusting losers or fuckboys, both of which I would say are generally true. A big reason for this is that our society demonizes masculinity, and so the ideas and stuff that men would use to make themselves more admirable and attractive to women are either frowned upon or just don't exist in society. Men use the idea of pride or meaning as a way to offset the difficulties of life, but modern society really provides neither. Young men are incredibly lost and depressed today, with no one giving them any direction forward, and their society telling them that they are the source of all problems.
This is why young men follow cult leaders like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, spend their lives playing video games or watching porn, and other things, because as a general rule, if young men have nothing worth dying for, they have nothing worth living for.
However, society tells young men just to go to their jobs and keep their heads down, meaning there isn't simply any way for men to appear attractive that's socially accepted, and life cannot be glorious or heroic, which is what men need to believe. This is why the movie Fight Club is so popular, because it's the perfect embodiment of what being a young man today feels like. An example of this sort of thing is that it's really bifurcated in what kinds of attractive men women fantasize about in our society. Either the strictly predatory like werewolf, Christian Grey, vampire, rappers and the like, or the completely effete like Orlando Bloom, One Direction, Machine Gun Kelly. And this isn't society is incapable of respecting an archetype of a man who has reached his masculinity in a healthy pro-social manner, like the cowboy, knight, hero, Mr. Darcy and the like, and without that, of course men won't appear attractive. Men lack socialization in modern society and are kind of just left out in limbo. I remember I was living in Mexico at age 19 with a bunch of guys, including a professional dating coach who was a friend of mine, and he pulled me over and told me I needed to change how I dress, lose weight, become more socially aware and the like in order to get girls. I totally changed my life, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. But what I've come to realize is that most men have never had a conversation or moment like that, or really anyone who has given them a realistic appraisal on how to be attractive to women, since society is uncomfortable with the idea of having any standards or stereotypes. Also, most young men don't really have squads of bros who will tell them what are the good things to do, or know a lot of girls who will say, "Holy shit, you can't do that." A very large amount of men really don't know how to flirt with women, dress well, and all that stuff. Without this socializing, you get a large class of genuinely creepy and weird young men. All of my attractive female friends have told me that they've had really strange and creepy experiences of guys doing bizarre and horrifying stuff, since society has no boundaries.
One of the major themes here is that you can't expect people to really be sane anymore, where for both men and women, it often seems like just extremely sociopathic or deranged or bizarre things have become much more normal as socialization is broken down.
Although this is certainly an overreaction, girls' top fears in first dates are that the guy is a serial killer. This is the origin of school shooters, in that these men realize they're screwed, but know that no one really does care about them since society is so atomized. The other thing girls dislike about guys is fuckboyism, which is a natural extension of male psychology, of trying to breed as much as possible, in a society that pushes for what amounts to free love and with the pill. In my opinion, although many of my best friends are fuckboys, they kinda destroy the sexual habitat since they create a low-trust environment in which women feel burned and like junk food that was eaten and thrown out.
From a guy's perspective, I understand being a fuckboy because it's in their innate nature and it's fundamentally the girl's responsibility for having slept with you.
Fuckboys leave in their trace lots of bitter women who then close themselves off from dating and men in general. Since the fuckboys are the ones that put themselves out more, women run into them more. I've heard genuine horror stories from women I know about guys they've dated, with some having very serious issues. What I think is that for these types of guys with psychological issues, sex is an obsession, so they're always looking for it. While the guys who would make better boyfriends or husbands are, I don't know, just busy living their lives. This is the origin of the statistic of why 15% more women say they're in relationships than men, since 4 girls can be with the same fuckboy. I actually know more men who are in situations like that with 4 girls that they're sleeping with and not actually in relationships than guys I know who are actually in traditional committed relationships. The general system I've seen in a lot of colleges is lots of girls pining after a couple fuckboy Chad types who use them for sex while the lower value guys don't get any sex. Another interesting point about the success of fuckboys really makes me wonder about attachment issues. Attachment issues are when you are incapable of being loved normally, or looking for relationships where the other partner can healthily reciprocate love. The reason I say this is that the guys who are the douchiest tend to do better with women, to a degree that doesn't seem like it should be happening with healthy evolutionary psychology. I mean, I know this on a personal basis, since when I started going to dates acting like I was totally phoning it in and low-key hating the girls started liking it a lot more. One of the problems with modern dating, in fact, is that people are scared to express their actual emotions because attachment problems are so terrible. Where I've gone on dates where the girl has said, "You are my ideal man, I want to spend all my life with you, I want to be with your friends," all that stuff. And then she's not interested in me. And then I've been on dates where I thought the girl hated me, and then it turned out she was in love with me. And it's because in modern dating, to express any excitement or happiness or other big emotions is terrifying for people. And so people try to be as unemotional as possible, which makes it a lot less pleasant or fun. And I mean, a big reason for that is because there are no social standards. And we live in such an anxious age because our culture is primarily driven off anxiety that anything that produces anxiety or any deviation from cold unemotionality is terrifying when you're first meeting a person. You see these attachment problems with popular romance novel characters often being complete sociopaths, whether with Christian Grey, Twilight vampires, and the like. Attachment problems have become the norm, where for a majority of the population, the idea of being loved is psychologically painful for them. This could have happened for a variety of reasons, but I spoke to the world's expert on attachment, and he said that it's been a process that started around World War I, kicked into overdrive with the baby boomers, and is in a very bad place now. On a broader level, this lack of trust and cooperation between the sexes has promulgated a massive divorce rate, which now stands at half of all marriages. This affects even the highest class of men like Bill Gates, Johnny Depp, Jeff Bezos, Kanye, Elon Musk, and that sort. Divorces are initiated 70% by women, and among college-educated women, 90%. This is probably since the court systems are insanely biased towards women, often with it being normal that they take the kids and the vast majority of the money. You'll hear countless horror stories if you look for them. However, marriage is a foundational part of society, and once you weaken it, you weaken the whole stability of a civilization. Men work hard with the knowledge that they can get married and reap the rewards that come from it. However, once you remove marriage as stability, it suddenly removes men's incentives to better themselves, and also creates a class of single mothers, which creates massive social issues in of itself. In his fascinating book, Sex and Civilization, J.D. Unwin goes through basically every civilization in the world and many historical societies to show that once societies weaken sexual restrictions, and especially marriage, they degrade socially. This is since people don't have the incentive to invest in a society, since they're either competing over sex, or they don't think their biological inheritance is assured. Once a society collapses all its sexual restrictions, it normally takes about a century, but he predicted Western civilization would fall into barbarism from 1960 to 2060. And it definitely seems like we're headed in that direction as our society becomes less and less functional. Another angle I haven't really gotten to in this video, but is really important, and that's because I cover it in almost every other video, is the economic and the political and the social, where we live in really hard economic and political and social times. And that bleeds into dating, where lots of young people simply cannot afford to have a family and are really financially struggling. And we're also a polarized society, which makes it very difficult to date people with different political allegiances. And I didn't talk about this a lot because this is such a big topic on my channel, but I wanted to just throw that in. Part 3, are we in a zoo? So far, the things I've talked about are the things that most of you could probably figure out on your own on an intuitive basis. Sure, technology in our society's culture creates problems with dating. However, the thing I'm going to propose next is something a lot of you probably can't even imagine, and will unsettle a lot of your worldviews. This is that urban humans today have lots of behaviors reminiscent of zoo animals. Zoo animals experience tremendous anxiety, pace around, have weird tics like licking off their fur, overeating, have to use drugs, masturbate obsessively, be unable to have children, grinding their teeth, over-grooming, and depression, all of which are normal in modern industrial societies. The biggest primatologist of the last century, Desmond Morris, has written several fascinating books that talk about this. I mean, in all reality, how different is modern industrial civilization in all actuality from a zoo? Many of us live in highly controlled boxes that we barely leave, especially with the internet. Our society protects us from any real threats. We do monotonous tasks, to get our daily supply of food. We're surrounded by strangers at all times, and we really don't have control of our lives. Rather, large transnational forces do and the like. I like the quote, "What you do to others will happen to you." And humanity, after centuries or millennia of caging its animals, has put itself into a cage. The thing to consider is that we aren't that different at all from those animals. We evolved to live in the wild, and religious tribes in the wilderness struggling together against the wild. Once you remove those conditions, we've stopped doing the things we evolved to do in the first place. In the same way that those lions and elephants should not be stuck in cages and should be out in their packs in the wild living their lives, even if they're much safer in the zoos, so should we. Something that modern civilization ignores is that the part of our brain that deals with emotion, and also by extension instinct, is exactly the same as other mammals, so the feelings of love, loneliness, horniness, and like that we feel are the exact same as a dog or a cat. We are animals. This brings up a separate perspective when you deal with the blank slate people, who say that human society should conform to their supposedly just and rational views of the world. But the thing I would say is that if humans evolved to have a certain kind of gender relations, you have to go with the grain to a great degree, whether or not you like it. Chimpanzees are naturally patriarchal, bonobos matriarchal, and gorillas polygamous in all of their communities. If you tried to build a monogamous gorilla society, patriarchal bonobo and the like, it would just fail. And you would see those apes being depressed and they wouldn't have children. Why would our societies be any different? All the science points to a massive part, but not all of our gender relations being genetically wired from birth, and large parts of them are universal in all cultures. An important comparison that ought to be made between zoo animals and modern industrial societies is the lack of agency. Although I don't condone terrorism, I think Ted Kaczynski makes an interesting point on how difficult it is to have power over your life in modern society. How we feel like useless cogs in the machine, where we're surrounded by uncaring strangers and the machine of industrial bureaucratic civilization. We work at large corporations for a boss that doesn't give a fuck about us, who tells us when and how to work, where the only thing expected of us is obedience in our time. We often live in big cities that make us feel like ants, and when we get old, we get shoved into retirement homes while we were raised by strangers at daycares and taught at schools to make us useful little cogs. You need to compare this to the pre-modern world, where almost everyone you dealt with was someone you knew from childhood, and your only authority in government was the local lord and priest. The greatest scholar of depression today, Johann Hari, has from studies found the conditions of powerlessness kind of cause our spirits to die, for us to lose creativity, initiative, and the like, and I'm guessing sexual virility. An example he gives is in his book is that after 12 hours of shaking paint as your job, the only thing you want to do is die on the couch in front of your TV, and you don't have the energy to build your community, create, and the like. Things like this deaden us and suppress our drive to breed in the same way the monotony of the zoo means animals struggle to breed there.
An interesting example I want to bring up is that there was an experiment that was run a couple times in the 60s called Mouse Utopia. And it's an experiment where they put 8 mice in a large cage and then gave them infinite amounts of food. So it was kind of a utopia where the mice could breed indefinitely. And so going from 8 mice to 2,200 mice, and as overcrowding set in, you started to see fascinating results where the colony started to fall apart, not even reaching the threshold of the maximum amount of population it could have, but due to living in a utopia with so many mice with no real threats, the mouse social structure started to break apart.
Female mice became more aggressive, with female mother mice pushing their sons out too young and not educating them properly. You saw a caste of male mice who refused to breed but would overgroom themselves, looking very effeminate, called the beautiful ones, and the mice stopped having children. There were growing groups of outcast generation mice that would hang out in the middle of the colony since they had nowhere to go. Mice society is based around alpha males having harems, but that system collapsed. You saw collapses in social connections as mice stopped being able to form friendships, and young female mice refused to breed, isolating themselves from men in society. Due to having a utopia where everyone was able to breed, thus resulting in the population going up enormously, thus causing overpopulation, the society fell apart. The mouse colony failed with the population crashing from 2,200 to 0. I'm sure you can draw a tremendous amount of parallels between this mouse society and our current one, between young people's unwillingness to have children, the rising homelessness crisis, and countless others.
Another thing I'm going to throw in is that the parts of our brain that control for sex and emotion are largely the same between mice and humans, where the only real difference between less developed mammals and human brain structures is that humans have a larger prefrontal cortex that controls self-discipline and rational planning, but the emotions that decide how that prefrontal cortex get used are the same across mammals.
However, I like to bring up Japan as an example where this whole trajectory is pushed incredibly far. Japan's an example of what the Western world should desperately try to avoid. 25% of Japanese men in their 30s are virgins. Over 40% of both sexes ranges 18 to 34 are virgins. In Japan, we see both groups of men in the mouse experiment, with the so-called herbivore men, who have no sense of masculinity, hiding themselves in video games and porn, alongside the effeminate, beautiful one pop stars, with neighboring Korea being a great example of K-pop. Japan has the lowest birth rate of any nation in the world, and is also the nation that has the least sex in general. Their population is projected to halve over the next few decades. My wonderful researcher Seamus has gone on an in-depth research project on the factors that drive population growth or stable birth rates. What he found is that society needs a combination of things in order to have a stable birth rate. It needs to be heavily rural, religious, and, to be perfectly honest, on the negative side of things, if women are less educated and it's patriarchal. This makes some degree of sense given those are the conditions that humanity evolved with. I don't want to go full Boko Haram and deny women education, but at the same time, I don't think industrial civilization can survive until it becomes religious and rural again, since non-rural, non-religious societies don't work. You never see urban populations ever in history that are replaceable, even in the pre-industrial world. Industrial countries normally go through incredibly rapid population growth during industrialization, and then their populations collapse very quickly. A point I've made before in these videos is that there isn't a single successful atheist society ever in history. At the same time, there was never a successful majority urban society before the Industrial Revolution. The reason that this is all so dire is that the industrial world is on an imminent trajectory for mass population collapse to a horrifying degree, like what I've mentioned in Japan. For Russia, China, most of Europe, South Korea, a lot of British Commonwealth countries and the like, we're looking at their populations going down by half by the end of the century. For the United States, the most rural and religious in the developed world, this process is smoother, but we're only buying a few more decades at most. The third world, which is urbanized but is still poor, you're seeing insanely rapid population growth collapses in places like Latin America, India, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the like. Even Africa, the only area with a still rapid population growth, is seeing said population growth collapsing at a very fast rate, faster than anyone imagined, with Africa too going to see declining populations in a few decades. It's hard to imagine how crippling this process might be. In a lot of these countries, like Germany or China, there are projected to be 2 7-year-olds for each 25-year-old, which literally means these countries collapses as functioning societies. In the wreckages of crises like this, of population collapses, and all the political and cultural drama that must go with that, I would imagine the rural and religious would inherit the world, since they would be the few to have children and thus create the next generations, that or immigrants. In some ways, it reminds me of the end of the classical world, where the urban societies of the Greeks, Romans, and Persians were replaced by the stronger breeding rural populations, thus resulting in the redneckification of both empires around 200 AD, the rise in religious fanaticism, collapsing populations, and de-urbanization, and then afterwards, the rise of the barbarian Slavs, Germans, and Arabs, who had much higher birth rates to dominance. I find the book Fitzpatrick's War interesting in this regard. In it, the world becomes overpopulated and incredibly decadent in the 20th and through the 21st centuries. Then the world system falls apart, plagues ravage the world, the birth rate collapses, and America falls into a civil war between religious rednecks and inner-city gangs, who are both trying to inherit the country as the mainstream American culture withers into decadence. The rednecks win and rebuild America in their image, similar to the rise of Christianity and the barbarians and the fall of Rome.
This is the future we're looking at as a society if we cannot fix our birth rate.
I bet this video didn't go in the direction you thought, as an explanation of modern dating would.
This is something that I'm genuinely worried about, because if you look across history, large groups of sexless young men are one of the best predictors for wars, state collapses, mass violence, and the like. And this is probably one of the worst eras in history for that. And as I've said before in previous videos, I think the far right will seize control of society over the next couple decades. And I'm currently working on a video about that. And I talked about it before, but since my audience is over 90% young men, and I honestly believe that the leaders of that movement are currently fans of this YouTube channel. The 15-year-olds that'll run the fascist dictatorship in 2040 are probably watching this right now. And as your cool older brother, I thought I'd just drop 2 pieces of advice. The first is it's so easy to get stuck in your hormones as a young guy and just go crazy. And fundamentally, it really doesn't matter if you get laid at a young age. The amount of pussy you get when you're 21 or 19 or anything like that has very little bearing upon the rest of your life, because your hormones are genetically wired for you to start having kids because that's what you needed to in the tribal world. But now you're hopefully using contraception. And my father once said that the value of a man is determined by his degree of honor, and Rudyard Kipling, my namesake, said that a man's ability to hold his head above a baying crazy crowd determines his value. I mean, boo fuckity who. Whoever told you life would be easy as a man? It could be so much worse. You could be starving, you could be in a war, and fundamentally, when all's said and done, at your grave, you'll think, did I stand with honor where I needed to? And the second point is I see a lot of demonization of women as a group in this right-wing space that I think will gain a lot more power. And I don't think that's right, because once you dehumanize a group, you remove their agency and story as a real people. And women today live pretty not great lives, and they have their own problems in the same way men do. And I completely understand why young men feel this way, because radical feminism blames men for everything in a really unfair way. So it feels as if it's fair to go the other way, but it's really not fair. And I can tell you from personal experience, there are lots of wonderful women out there in the same way that there are lots of wonderful men. And we're all really just struggling against a harsh and often painful world, but one that also has beauty and meaning. I promise you that at some point things will get better, just because that's always the case with recessions. And our society will fall apart if they don't get better, and our society's not dumb enough that it won't work through a lot of these problems, especially adapting to technology. And I mean, if you want to say this is a sexual Great Depression, then wouldn't you want to be young during the Depression so that when you're older and trying to get married, you can be doing it in the golden age of the 50s?